Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're not going to be doing alternative history. We're going to be asking a very fundamental question with regard to the reparations debate, right? So it's going to be complicated, right? There's going to be lots of figures thrown about here. There's going to be lots of philosophical things to kind of take in consideration. And, you know, obviously there's going to be some people who are going to be pro reparations and some people who are going to be against it. So hopefully this video in a way can be, you know, a unifying thing for a very divisive topic, right? For this video, we're not going to be talking about what the public opinion is on the matter, yeah, because it's very divided, but it seems to be a minority opinion at the moment that there ought to be reparations, right? So we're not talking about that, we're not talking about the politics of it, but for this video, hopefully whether you're in favor of it or you're against it, it's going to be useful for you. So if you're against reparations, hopefully this video gives you a lot of ammunition within your argument. And again, if you're in favor of it, hopefully this also gives you some ammunition as well, gives you some food for thought. Because what you have to understand with this issue is it's almost like a scale, yeah. I kind of realized this while making it up, right? So there's a scale from least fair to fairest. And there's also a scale from least complex to most complex. So the most complex solution is actually going to be the fairest solution, right? And the least complex is also going to be the least fair, right? So we'll get into this in a little bit. So it sounds a bit confusing, a bit cryptic now, but as the video goes on, hopefully that will make a bit more sense. So even if we just grandfather in that, yes, we're all 100% in favor of it, yeah, let's just say for argument's sake, we're all on the same boat and we all want it, right? But we're arguing now about how it should be implemented, right? So within all of this, there's three main questions that we have to ask, right? The first question is how much should be paid out? The second is who should receive it? And the third is who should pay it. And these are three fundamental questions which if we can't answer, then there is no argument about reparations, right? So this is what this video is going to try and look into. So just for a little bit of clarity, reparations is paying money for past transgressions, right? So if I assaulted you in the past, then I have to pay you reparations. I have to give you financial, or I have to give you some sort of support in order to help you get through the fact that I've wronged you in the past. So there have been many examples of this reparations, and we'll get onto some other examples a little bit later. But you know, the most pressing one that we can think of is the case between Israel and West Germany in 1952. So 1952, this is just 7 years after the Holocaust, and West Germany did a deal with Israel in which they agreed over a period of about 12 years to give them compensation for the loss of property and for the damages done during the Holocaust. So what we have to think of is obviously Israel got its independence in 1948, and it was a very war-racked country. It only just survived the war in 1948 against all the Arabs, and it was obviously it needed a lot of infrastructure, it needed a lot of development, it needed basically a boost to its economy. And obviously the survivors of the Holocaust had many of their possessions taken away from them by the Nazi regime. And so Israel went to West Germany, because obviously East and West Germany was divided at this point. You know, East Germany did not pay them anything, and neither did any of the other communist countries of Eastern Europe. So West Germany was the only country that was willing to, and so yeah, so the burden kind of fell on them. So the figures that you can see on the bottom of the screen here, yeah, of this $120 billion, which is given out over this time, yeah, this is the calculations I've got to find these figures, right? So if I've made a mistake, please correct me in the comment section, but this is just from the findings I've looked at, this is what I've found, yeah, right? So it seems to be roughly about $120 billion in today's money, right, which was given from the state of West Germany to Israel. So this represented, over this 12-year period, it represented around 15% of Israel's GNP growth, right? So that's quite significant, right? And roughly about a third of Israel's electricity needs were set up through this. Roughly about half of Israel's railway infrastructure was set up through this. So if we think about Israel today, it's a tech hub, it's an innovation hub, you know, people from all around the world, you know, with different startups and everything. So Israel today is an absolute powerhouse, right? But if they hadn't received this early infrastructure, yeah, and this early help, yeah, from the reparations from West Germany, would they be as advanced as they are today? Probably not. Like, it would have been quite difficult for them to have just got this 120 billion some other way, right? So in many ways, Israel today is as prosperous as it currently is, partly because it received this reparations. But although many people point to this and say, look, this is an example of people paying reparations, right? The problem with this is that, and this is what you'll find in many other like cases of reparations being paid to people, the vast majority of the cases, it's been people who have lived through and suffered through certain like ills, and within their lifetime they as individuals have received compensation for crimes done to them as individuals, right? So you're not talking about people like descendants of people whose ancestors were put through these things. You're talking about people in life like who had actually suffered these things. So this is where some of the complexities of around like this argument kind of falls apart, because if we talk about the emancipation of slavery within the British Empire, that happened in 1838. If we're talking about emancipation with regard to the United States, that happened in 1865. So no one is alive today who was alive back then, right? So there's no slave owners, right? And there's no slaves, right, who are still alive like from that time. So many of the arguments with regard to reparations for slavery, yeah, it becomes a bit more complex. We're not going to talk about in this video about the argument with regard to reparations for colonization. We've kind of covered that in some of our other videos. If you'd like me to go into more depth in that in a future video, please let me know. But again, it's a lot more complicated than one might expect, right? If you actually drill down into the data, it's a question of how much should be paid into who, and should there even be any money paid, etc., etc. So it's very, very complicated. So for this video, when we talk about reparations, we're talking about reparations in the context of transatlantic slavery. And again, just to make it even clearer, we're talking about slavery with regard to the English-speaking world, right? So we're talking about America, and we're talking about the British Empire in the Caribbean. We're not talking about the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French Empire, all of which like obviously had many, many slaves, and we're not talking about any other empires either. Like, we're just talking about, you know, for the sake of brevity, England, and we're talking about America, right? So that's all we're talking about. So now we're going to be talking about the simpler part of the debate with regard to reparations, and that's going to be focusing on the British Empire. And notice I say the word simpler instead of simple, because it's still incredibly complicated, right? But it's way simpler than is the case for American reparations, right? So we're going to drill down into this, right? So Britain, at the time of emancipation, signed into law that there was going to be compensation for the slave owners, because you have to understand that at that time, people obviously viewed the slaves as the property of the people, right? And so it was seen as a thing where the British government couldn't deprive people of their property without giving them just compensation, right? So as a result, the slave owners were given compensation, and they were given £20 million, right? So in today's figures, that equates to about £2.6 billion, right? And this was given to 40,000 slave owners, and this was for the price of 665,000 slaves, right? This is the total number of slaves in the British Caribbean. So this means that each slave owner on average received about £65,000, right, from the British taxpayer. And actually this figure was not fully paid off until 2015. So like, you know, so even their descendants were still receiving some money with regard to paying this off. So that's something we have to kind of bear in mind as well, that this isn't like ancient history. This was finally sorted out in 2015, because like it kind of dragged on for that amount of time. So if we take that figure and divide it amongst each slave, we can see that the slave owners received about £30 per slave, and when translated in today's figures, that's about £3,925 per slave. So this is the cost of a slave in the eyes of the British government. So obviously some people received much more than this. Some people received like millions and millions of pounds because they owned many, many slaves. However, we can kind of work out roughly from the figures here that on average, the average slave owner seemed to have owned about 16 slaves, because, you know, if we take this figure and divide it by that figure, then that's what it kind of seems to indicate. So this is why I say the argument is simpler, right? Because we have clear written records of the government giving money to this person, that person, this person, that person for this many slaves, and you know, so it's all clearly written down and it's all clearly documented, right? So we can see from this which families received how much and, you know, and for how many slaves. Now let's start off with the least complex solution to this, right? And it's also, as you'll see, going to be the least fair, which is this. If we took £2.6 billion in today's figures and divided it amongst the 6 million people of the English-speaking Caribbean, because obviously English-speaking Caribbean, they're the ones who were part of the British Empire, so we're not talking about all the other places in the Caribbean. Just talking about the English-speaking Caribbean, it's roughly 6 million people. So if we took that £2.6 billion and divided it equally amongst the 6 million English-speaking Caribbeans, we can see that each person would receive £433 in today's figure. So if you had a family of 5, then that family would receive about £2,165. So just to give a little bit of context of this, the GDP for Jamaica in 2018 was about $15 billion, right? So if you convert that into pounds, that's roughly £13 billion or thereabouts. So let's just keep it very simple. So Jamaica represents about half the population of the former British West Indies now. So, you know, there's about 3 million people in Jamaica, there's about 6 million people in the English-speaking Caribbean as a whole. So we can kind of see from this that if we were to take this money and divide it equally amongst the people there, it would actually boost the economy of the English-speaking West Indies up by about 10% of their GDP or thereabouts, right? So if I've got some of the figures wrong in that, excuse me, some of the figures like fluctuate year on year. It's a little bit complicated, so yeah, but let's just take that as a given. So 10% of their GDP. So if we were to basically uplift the economy of the West Indies by an extra 10%, that could have great long-term ramifications. Yeah, like, so there could be more infrastructure being spent on different things. There could be different health, different education initiatives, all these kind of things, right? Different business initiatives to kind of get them more going and stuff, like in terms of like new like tech hubs, etc. So there's lots of things which could be done within that, or even just like tackling poverty, just giving that money just to the poorest people within those societies. However, this is where we start to really understand that this is coming up against the more philosophical part of it. And this is why I say the least fair solution is also the least complicated. This is very simple. This is just taxing people in Britain and then giving money to the governments in the Caribbean. But the problem with all this is that there's obviously a lot of complexities with that, right? Not every person who's in the British Caribbean is the descendant of a slave. And not every person in Britain is a descendant of a slave owner. So this is where we kind of like start to really kind of have to scale it down. So for instance, just taking me as an example, right? On my mum's side, right, I'm from Barbados. So I was obviously the descendant of a slave. So should I as a British person be paying taxes and then not receiving the just compensation within the system? And then also as well, bear in mind that there's still many people who are the direct descendants of slave owners who are living in the Caribbean. You know, would they receive money from this? So what, would I as a descendant of a slave be paying the descendant of a slave owner? And then never mind obviously the more recent immigrants like to the Caribbean, etc., like, you know, that's, you know, it's all just very complicated. So let's take it up another notch of like fairness and complexity. Okay, let's say all the descendants of former slaves in the Caribbean. So we're not talking about American slavery because they got their independence in 1776. So, you know, that's an American problem from that point on. We're just talking about emancipation within the British Empire, which is mainly just like the British Caribbean. So should we just take all the people who are direct descendants of Caribbean slaves? Well, that gets very complicated because obviously, again, people move, right? So there's people who are in Canada, people in America, people in Australia, people in France, people all over the world, right? So if you're going to pay the descendants of every Caribbean slave, that's going to get very, like, on a logistical basis, that's going to get very complicated to do, right? And then never mind the fact that there's obviously many people in the Caribbean who live in the UK as well. So that's obviously very complex. So let's say, for instance, right, we get all the white people and we do a tax on all the white people and we give it to all the black people. Okay, well then not every black person is the descendant of a slave, right? Not every black person is from the Caribbean, no. So, and then not every white person, either is from Britain in the first place, you know, people from Poland, Ireland, etc., etc. Then on top of that, we're talking, as we've said here, 40,000 families. Britain at that time had a population of 20 million. So you're talking about a tiny, tiny proportion of people who owned slaves versus the vast majority of people who didn't own slaves. Yes, you can say obviously many people benefited from it. There were some slave owners who put money into railways and into the British Museum and many other kind of like national art galleries, etc., etc. So there was some slave owners who put money back into the British economy in a way which benefited the population as a whole. But for the most part, this money was a transfer of money from the taxpayer to the elites who were already like incredibly wealthy because they owned slaves. Like, it's obviously not cheap to have these slaves. So you're talking about people who are already incredibly wealthy and the rest of us who are not descendants of them having to foot the bill for them. So this is inherently not fair. You know, it's a little bit more complex, so it's a little bit fairer, but it still isn't really fair. Okay, so let's say we do probably the most fair thing, yeah, right, and like the most complex, right? Let's find all the descendants of the slave owners, because we've got the figures here, we can see which families it was, we can see how much they received, and let's go to them and let's just do a special tax on them and say, you received this much, you need to give this much, and then all of their descendants, you go, right, here you go, like, you know. So, okay, that in theory works, right? However, what if, you know, because obviously you're talking about an expanse of like well over 150 years, right? So, you know, so some of these families, their financial circumstances might have changed over that time, right? So a family which might have received £1 million back then might now be on benefits, right? Whereas a family which received like £4,000 might have owned like one slave, you know, all of a sudden now they might be worth £1 billion, right? So how are you taking this figure from these people and like how are you working it out? And then also people obviously have many descendants, and then obviously it's, you know, the whole issue is very complicated. I hope that you understand like this part of it already, right? You're starting to get the idea that the issue is incredibly complicated and that it's not a one size fits all thing, and it's not a simple thing of right, let's do this and then pay this out, etc., etc. So even ignoring all the politics about whether this would ever happen, the public opinion, the politics about this, the different party politics, etc., etc. Even if everything was yes, 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 let's get this done, how do we get this done? This is the inherent problem, right? How much should be paid? Right, so in this case here, we've at least ticked that thing off, right? This is how much should be paid, 2.6 billion. Who should pay it? Don't know. Who should receive it? Don't know. This is part of the problem. You know, so yeah, so this is, as I said, the simpler one. Now we're going to get onto America, which is even more complicated than this case. So now we're going to be talking about the issue of reparations within the context of America. Now, before we kind of delve into the American slavery part of the debate, we have to see that actually the US federal government has had a record of paying people for past transgressions, right? So most notably, you can see is in two cases. You can see this with the Indian Claims Commission. So this was a commission set up from 1946 up until 1978, in which basically the American government gave back some compensation for stolen lands, yeah, taken from the Indians, right? So this was when the American government had set up treaty obligations and then had deliberately broken these treaties, right? So the Indian tribes were able to claim the money back from this. However, by claiming this money, they negated all future claims to this land. So this is basically a kind of a cash in exchange for land kind of like deal, right? So over a period of 22 years, I think 176 Indian tribes or thereabouts like kind of received in today's figures about $1.3 billion. So obviously this is quite a small amount of money, but the argument for this is a little bit stronger than the one for slavery, because 1946 is not that long after like the Indian Wars. So the final kind of like conflict in the Indian Wars between United States government and like the Indian tribes was the massacre of Wounded Knee in 1890. So this is kind of seen as the end of the Indian Wars. So that's, you know, that's 56 years later, right? So having this commission set up. So within living memory, there were obviously some Indians who had been the victims of these things, right? And they themselves were receiving some of the money for this. But again, it's a tiny, tiny amount. And also something to bear in mind is that the Native Americans themselves are, you know, the most disadvantaged group within America. Yeah, we often focus a lot on like a black-white issue, but Native Americans have like much higher rates of poverty, etc., which doesn't get the kind of address that it ought to be getting. Not saying that one group should be prioritized over the other, but it's a thing of, we do have to recognize that sometimes there's other groups which are not getting in the press as much, but like their voices also need to be heard. So the second example is in 1988, and this is with regard to Japanese Americans who, during World War II, many of them were interned, right? So there's about 120,000 Japanese Americans who were rounded up and put into concentration camps by the US government because they feared that they were spying for the Japanese government. So in 1988, the survivors of that were given money from the US government, right? So there's about 88,000 survivors, and they received on average the equivalent in 2019 figures, of $43,000 each, right? So this is quite a significant amount of money. However, this figure of about 3.5 billion, right? This was only given to the survivors. It wasn't given to the descendants of the survivors. This was just the last few survivors, almost 40 years after the conflict, they were given money for it. So considering that the Japanese American population today numbers about 1.5 million, you can see that actually this figure is actually, although it's substantial for the people who received that figure, it's actually a tiny like drop in the ocean. Especially when you consider that Japanese Americans are actually some of the wealthiest demographics like within the United States at the current time. So this cash payment didn't really affect that. It helped some individuals, but by and large, many of these people bounced back from that discrimination during the war. And also bear in mind the fact that, again, this is living people. This is the US government paying money to living victims of the thing. So this is, again, differentiates it from the case for American slavery. Now, the case for American slavery is less simple than it is for the British one, right? And the reason for this is that while the British government paid the former slave owners for the price of their slaves, the American government did not. The American government was obviously engaged in a civil war, and so the opinion of the North was basically, we either want to punish these southern slave owners, or at very least we want to just take their slaves off them, but just leave them to have their property. So no one was compensating them for the loss of their property, right? No one was doing that. And as black people were not included on the US Census until 1870, it's very difficult to kind of see which slave owners owned what people, etc., etc. So there's not really a database for that. There's no equivalent amount which you can translate into today's figures of this is how much the federal government gave these slave owners and this is how much ought to have been given to the slaves. So we can really see from this, like, just the beginning bit of like, how much should be paid out. There's already a massive question mark about that, which there isn't the equivalent within the British Empire's case. So something which has often been said by people is the famous 40 acres and a mule, right? But where does this 40 acres and a mule kind of come from? Well, it's actually, if you dig down into it, it's actually a very specific thing. So General Sherman, as he was coming through the South, he made his order, his famous Field Order number 15, which laid out that the former slaves should be compensated by having some land. So he set out a tract of land along the coast of Georgia and Florida and South Carolina, I believe, as well. And this was the area of about 400,000 acres. And this area was to be split up amongst the 18,000 or so families in that surrounding area. So this is kind of the root of this 40 acres and a mule. The mule part was added later. And President Lincoln, he supported this. However, he was assassinated, and the following president, Andrew Johnson, he got rid of this order, right? So this was not given all slaves in America 40 acres, right? This was given some slaves in some particular region of the country some land from the former slave owners, right? So the population of slaves at the time in America was about 4 million. So this covered just 18,000 families, right? So you're talking maybe 100,000, maybe a few 100,000 at best. So this figure was never given out for the whole of the country, right? This was never set like that. It was a very specific case. And so when people kind of say about this case of 40 acres and a mule, this is kind of the origins of it, but it doesn't encompass the whole of the South's population of former slaves. So people in the present day, they often look at the land that's been spoken about and they go, oh, well, this land is now worth such and such trillions of dollars, right? So therefore, this is how much it would be. Some figures I've seen for reparations have been, can't lie, kind of ridiculous, right? So, bearing in mind that the US economy is $21 trillion, people have made the claim that reparations should be, some figures have been 14 trillion, So you're talking about almost 2/3 of the US economy should be given as reparations. That to me seems A, completely unworkable. That's just not ever going to happen and stuff, yeah. And B, it doesn't seem. I know that obviously there was centuries and centuries of slavery, and you can't really put a price on torture and enslavement and etc. etc. But at the end of the day, in terms of pure money terms, it's like it's difficult to make an economic argument for that. You can make a moral argument for that, but it's difficult to make an economic argument that 2/3 of the entire country wealth should be handed out as reparations. Never mind the logistical things and the political realities of that just never happening. So again, it's difficult, as we can see, to put a figure on how much slaves should be owed. Like if America in 1865 had given out 40 acres to every single black family in the South, yes, the parity between blacks and whites in the South would probably be less than it is currently. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily equate to that. We can't predict the effects of something 150 years afterwards, right? Like, how do we know that that land necessarily would have been as productive as it was for the whites? How do we know? If you give people money, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people are going to spend it wisely. I'm not saying that people would have spent it unwisely, but you can't assume how millions of people are going to act on something 150 years after it's happened. You can't. It's the most of all the kind of what if scenarios we've ever done. Like, there's a reason why I haven't done this, because the multiplier effect, the butterfly effect of this is so vast. You can't even. We can't really say like kind of like what would really happen. You're talking about such a vast expanse of time that you can't accurately say that this is where black people would be today if this 40 acres and a mule had been given. And then add to this the fact that, obviously not all African Americans are the descendants of those slaves, right? So again, when we look at who received this money, about 80% of African Americans today are so-called native African Americans. So this is people who are descendants of it. But the other 20% are recent migrants, either from Africa or from the West Indies. And as we said before about the argument with regard to, if they come from West Indies, that's a sort of complex thing as well in terms of who pays what and does that get paid, etc. So long story short, like, it's not as clear cut as saying, let's, for instance, tax all white people in America and give it to all black people in America. Because first of all, not all black people were the descendants of slaves. And obviously, if you look at white people, many white people were, the descendants of immigrants who came after the period of emancipation. You think about many Jews, Irish, Italians, etc., etc. Should they have to pay for like slaves which their ancestors never owned? So if you want to scale it back again to the South, you want to look at white slave owning families in the South and look at their descendants and then be like, okay, we want to tax them to pay for the descendants of African American slaves. That would probably be the fairest of all those things, but it's also the most complex. And again, we're talking about the issues of how do we know that many of those like white families are now not like incredibly poor and living in trailer parks and stuff. And it's, the whole thing is very, very complicated. It's not a clear cut simple thing at all. And also when you compare white poverty and black poverty, so if you look at the poverty rates and look at the gap between white and black across the different states, it's not immediately apparent. Like, when I was looking into the research for this, I was expecting the southern states where you had the most slaves for there to be the biggest amount of gap, especially where you think about like the legacy of Jim Crow, etc., etc. As you can see on the maps here, it's not as clear cut as that. So the argument about, so if we'd given money to poor blacks at that time, the gap between white and black probably be a little bit less, but it's not immediately apparent to me that like it would have just solved like all the kind of like issues at all, because poor whites in the South obviously didn't receive any reparations because they didn't own any slaves, etc., etc., and they didn't reap any real benefits from slavery, and yet they're still kind of on parity in many regards to many of their other like poor black counterparts. So again, it's a very complicated issue. It's not, to excuse the pun, it's not a black and white issue, because there's so many factors we have to deal with answering this question of reparations and stuff. It's not a straightforward thing at all. And to even start to kind of go down this road, there's so many things you have to take in consideration. And those three fundamental questions of how much should be paid, who receives it, and who pays it, right? Those are three fundamental questions which, if you don't have good solid answers to all of them, then the whole argument about reparations kind of grinds to a halt, because then it just becomes people plucking out random figures and then just being like, right, white people need to pay this, or the US government needs to pay this. And it's, it doesn't make sense to tax people to give them money back. If someone has wronged me in the past, it doesn't make sense for me to have to pay them first for them to then like pay me back. If you had it through general taxation, if the US government just said, we're going to tax the general population and give this money, then there would be many people who are descendants of slaves who would have to pay taxes to then receive that same tax money back. So as you can see from this, it's an incredibly complicated topic, and I hope that it's given people a lot of food for thought. Hopefully the comment section is not too crazy, because this is a very divisive issue. If I've missed out any facts, please understand I'm not trying to come from a place of malintent. There's obviously a lot of things to get through here. There's so many factors which I probably haven't had the time to look into as well, so I'll be very pleased for people to make that known in the comment section, obviously in a respectful way. And yeah, that's a very, very complicated issue. So hope that you enjoyed it, and yeah, definitely watch a lot more of our other videos. Hit the like button. I think in the last video I forgot to tell people to hit the like button, yeah, or I forgot to put the little thing up there. But anyway, hit the like button. And then also stay tuned for our next video, which is going to be on what if the Immigration Act was never passed, right? So this is looking at two immigration acts in America. One is in 1924 and the other one is in 1965. So the one in 24 restricted the number of non-white Northern Europeans coming to America, and then the one in 65 basically got rid of that. So we're looking at the demographic trends from the period before 24 and then the period after 65, right? And seeing how if one hadn't been passed, what would America kind of look like, and then if the other one hadn't been passed, what would America look like? So in the one case, you can see America being a lot more diverse. So the one in 24 restrict the amount of diversity that's coming into America, and the one in 65 kind of unleashed the diversity of American immigration. So that's something to kind of definitely look forward to. So yeah. So I really hope you like that video, and definitely, like I said, stay tuned for that next one. And also as well, before I forget, as we've said in previous videos, we are coming to the end of our alternative history series. So if you have any ideas for alternative history videos that you'd like me to do, please let me know in the comment section, and I'll get around to doing them if they're good ideas. And yeah, that being said, have a great day, and bye.